In the country music world of the 1950s and 1960s, the Wilburn Brothers were the epitome of perfect brotherly harmony. With their sweet hits and polished TV personas, Doyle and Teddy Wilburn captured the hearts of millions. Their story was one of rising from poverty to conquering the Grand Ole Opry stage and helping superstar Loretta Lynn in her early days. But behind that success was personal tragedy, a fading career, and the pain of the one left behind when half of the harmony was gone forever. Today we explore their story of brotherhood, fame, and inevitable separation. To truly understand the Wilburn Brothers, you have to understand the world that made them. Picture rural America in the 1930s. The Great Depression had cast a long, dark shadow across the land, and in places like Hardy, Arkansas, where Doyle and Teddy were born, life was a daily struggle. This was the Ozark region, a place of rugged beauty and deep-rooted poverty. Families like the Wilburns lived by the sweat of their brow, their lives dictated by the seasons, by the success or failure of a crop, and by the sheer grit required to put food on the table. The scars of the Dust Bowl were fresh, and though Arkansas wasn't the epicenter, the economic desperation was a palpable, nationwide phenomenon. For many, the only escape was through the airwaves. In an era before television dominated every living room, the radio was the family hearth. Families would gather around a large wooden console, its tubes glowing warmly in the dark, to listen to the distant, crackling broadcasts from magical places. On a Saturday night, the most magical place of all was Nashville, Tennessee, and the signal beaming out from WSM radio. It was the Grand Ole Opry. For millions of people in isolated rural communities, the Opry was more than just a show. It was a lifeline. It was the sound of people who looked like them, talked like them, and sang about their lives, their heartaches, and their faith. The voices of Roy Acuff, the Carter family, and Uncle Dave Macon were the voices of trusted friends. But more than that, music was something you made yourself. It was the sound of a fiddle on the front porch after a long day's work, a gospel hymn sung in a small wooden church on a Sunday morning. It wasn't just entertainment, it was the glue that held communities and families together in the face of overwhelming hardship. This was the world that Leslie and Bertie Wilburn brought their children into. They were a hardworking family, and music was as essential to them as air and water. Their father, Leslie, was a fine fiddle player, a man who could draw a lifetime of joy and sorrow from 4 strings. Their mother, Bertie, accompanied him on the guitar, her steady rhythm the bedrock of the family's sound. The house was filled with the traditional songs of the Ozark Mountains, melodies passed down through generations. It was in this environment that their 5 children, Lester, Leslie Jr., known as Van, Lorene, Doyle, and Teddy, grew up. For Doyle, born in 1930, and Teddy just a year later in 1931, this musical upbringing wasn't just a pastime, it was their destiny. They absorbed the harmonies and rhythms as if by osmosis. Before they could even fully grasp the meaning of the words, they were learning to blend their young voices in the back seat of the family car, finding that unique resonant space where one voice ends and the other begins. The family's talent was undeniable, a fact that didn't escape their neighbors and friends. By 1938, Leslie Wilburn, with a promoter's spirit, recognized that his children's musical gifts were something special, perhaps even a ticket to a better life. He formed a family act, initially featuring the 4 oldest children. They started performing at local pie suppers, school functions, and any small gathering that would have them. It was a humble beginning, but it was professional training of the highest order. The star power of the 2 youngest boys, however, quickly became apparent. Doyle, even as a child, possessed a steady confidence, the natural air of a frontman. Teddy, the youngest, had a bright-eyed, infectious charm that could melt any heart. Their voices together were the main attraction. By the time Teddy was just 8 years old, he and his 10-year-old brother Doyle were the centerpiece of the Wilburn family act, which now included their older siblings Lester on the mandolin and Lorene on the accordion, with Van occasionally joining in. They weren't just a cute novelty. They were astonishingly good. Their harmonies were preternaturally tight, a sound that seemed to come from a single, unified soul. Their father, Leslie, saw the potential and made a life-altering decision. He became their full-time manager, promoter, and driver. He packed the family into a car, and they hit the road, touring the South tirelessly. These were not glamorous tours by any stretch of the imagination. This was the late 1930s and early 1940s. They played in tiny, un-air-conditioned theaters, on the back of flatbed trucks in dusty town squares, and in school gymnasiums. They often performed multiple shows a day, sometimes driving hundreds of miles between gigs on rough, unpaved roads. It was a grueling, nomadic life for anyone, let alone for children who should have been in school and playing with friends. But it was on these hard scrabble tours that Doyle and Teddy learned the fundamentals of their craft. They learned how to connect with an audience, how to project their voices over a noisy crowd, and how to read each other's musical cues with just a glance. Most importantly, they learned to rely on each other completely. Their brotherhood was forged in the crucible of the open road, a bond strengthened by shared hardships and shared dreams. Their big break came in 1940. A talent scout heard the family perform and arranged for an audition with the biggest star in country music, the man who was the face and voice of the Grand Ole Opry, Roy Acuff. Acuff was so floored by the prodigious talent of the young Wilburns, especially the flawless harmony of the two little boys, that he immediately brought them onto the Opry stage as regular performers. Imagine the scene. Teddy not even 10 years old, and Doyle just 11, standing in the hallowed circle on the stage of the Ryman Auditorium, the mother church of country music. They were broadcasting their family harmony live on WSM to millions of listeners across the country. It was the absolute pinnacle of the country music world, a dream so impossibly large that few ever achieved it, and they were living it as children. For a brief, shining moment, the Wilburn family were national stars. However, their meteoric rise was cut short by a force even more powerful than Roy Acuff, child labor laws, and the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. Concerns were raised about the children's grueling performance schedule and their lack of formal schooling. It was a different era, but the authorities intervened. The family was heartbreakingly forced to leave the Opry and return to a more conventional life back home. The dream, it seemed, was over, and the psychological impact on the children of being on top of the world one day and back in a classroom the next must have been immense. For most child stars, that would have been the end of the story. A brief, bright flame extinguished too soon. But the Wilburn brothers were different. The fire had been lit, and the taste of success, however brief, was something they would never forget. They spent their teenage years finishing their education but never stopped playing music, their skills growing more polished with each passing year. After finishing high school, they were determined to reclaim their destiny. They first reformed the family band, but as the older siblings began to marry and start their own families, the act naturally coalesced around the two brothers, whose harmony had always been its core. In the early 1950s, they officially began performing as the Wilburn Brothers duo. They quickly caught the ear of a promoter for the Louisiana Hayride, a popular radio show broadcast from Shreveport, Louisiana. The Hayride was famously a stepping stone to the Opry, a launching pad for future legends. It was on that very stage that the Wilburns would share bills with a shy, charismatic young singer named Elvis Presley, just as his own career was about to explode. Things were looking up, their momentum was building. But once again, fate intervened. The Korean War broke out, and in 1951, both Teddy and Doyle were drafted into the United States Army. Their burgeoning career was put on hold for 2 years as they served their country. It was another devastating setback, a momentum killer that could have permanently derailed their ambitions. Yet the time apart, the discipline of military life, and the perspective it gave them only seemed to strengthen their resolve. When they were honorably discharged in 1953, they were no longer boys with a dream. They were men on a mission. The post-war country music scene was a different world. It was becoming more professional, more polished. The business was centering itself in Nashville around a core group of producers, publishers, and elite session musicians. The Wilburns headed straight for the heart of it all. Armed with their undeniable talent and a veteran's determination, they reconnected with the Grand Ole Opry. This time, there were no child labor laws to stand in their way. On the strength of their stunning harmonies, they were officially made members of the Opry cast in 1953. This time, they were there to stay. A year later, they signed a coveted recording contract with Decca Records, placing them in the immensely capable hands of the legendary producer, Owen Bradley. Bradley was one of the key architects of the Nashville sound, a smoother, more sophisticated style of country music that aimed to cross over to a wider pop audience. He replaced the raw sounds of fiddles and steel guitars with lush string arrangements, smooth background vocals from groups like the Jordanaires, and a polished production style. While some traditional artists chafed under this new countrypolitan sound, the Wilburn Brothers thrived. Their pristine, intricate harmonies were perfectly suited to Bradley's meticulous production style. They worked with Nashville's finest session players, the legendary A-Team, musicians like Floyd Kramer on piano and Grady Martin on guitar. Their first charting single, Go Away With Me, released in 1955, was a sign of things to come. The hits started rolling in, one after another, defining the latter half of the 1950s and the entirety of the 1960s for the duo. Songs like Which One Is to Blame, a classic cheating song, the upbeat Trouble's Back in Town, and the moody, atmospheric Roll Muddy River became staples of country radio. Their signature song, Heard Her Once for Me, released in 1966, was a masterclass in emotional storytelling, a heartbreaking plea from a man to his romantic rival, delivered with their flawless, aching harmony. Throughout this golden era, the Wilburn Brothers were a constant presence on the country charts. They were dapper, professional, and immensely popular. They had finally and definitively achieved the dream that had been ignited on the Opry stage all those years ago. But Doyle and Teddy were more than just talented singers. They were incredibly savvy businessmen, a rarity for artists in that era. Doyle, in particular, had a sharp, strategic mind for the industry. He had seen firsthand how artists could sign away their futures for a pittance, and he was determined to control his own destiny. Together, they made a series of brilliant moves that would make them two of the most powerful men in Nashville. In 1957, they founded the Surefire Music Company, a music publishing house. This was a stroke of genius. In Nashville, the song is king, and publishing is the kingdom. It meant that not only did they profit from their own songs, but they also owned the publishing rights and earned royalties from songs they pitched to other artists. They had an incredible ear for a hit song, and Surefire quickly became one of the most successful publishing firms on Music Row. publishing early classics for a young Merle Haggard and many others. Their empire didn't stop there. They also established the Wilhelm Talent Agency, a booking agency that managed the careers of a growing roster of country stars. And perhaps most significantly, they embraced the new, powerful medium of television. In 1963, they launched the Wilburn Brothers Show, a syndicated weekly music program. In an era when network television was still hesitant to feature country music, syndication was key. They produced the show themselves and sold it directly to local stations across the country. It was one of the first country music shows to be filmed and distributed in color, making it visually vibrant and highly marketable. The show was a massive success. It featured the brothers' smooth banter and performances, but its real power was as a platform. Week after week, audiences tuned in to see legends like Ernest Tubb, Bill Monroe, and Webb Pierce, alongside the next generation of hitmakers. The Wilburn brothers weren't just participating in the country music industry, they were actively shaping it. They had become kingmakers. And this is where their story intersects with another, and where their legacy becomes forever entwined with one of country music's most iconic figures. In the early 1960s, a young, unknown singer from the coal mining hills of Butcher Holler, Kentucky, was trying to make her way in Nashville. Her name was Loretta Lynn. She had a voice that was as raw and real as the Appalachian mountains she came from, and she wrote songs with a brutal, unflinching honesty that was utterly unheard of at the time. She was a phenomenal talent, but she was an outsider, unschooled in the polished ways of Music Row. The Wilburns heard her perform and were immediately captivated. They saw the spark, the fire, the undeniable star quality. They invited her to be a regular performer on their television show, giving her the kind of national exposure that was simply priceless for a new artist. Their support went far beyond a few guest appearances. Doyle, the businessman, saw the immense potential. He signed Loretta to their surefire publishing company and essentially became her manager and mentor. He guided her, fought for her, and believed in her. It was the Wilburns who championed her unique autobiographical songwriting when other industry figures told her it was too controversial, too hillbilly. They helped her secure better record deals and higher profile tour dates. For a time, it was a beautiful, mutually beneficial partnership. The Wilburns' business empire grew with Loretta's soaring success, and Loretta had the powerful backing she needed to become a superstar. Her first #1 hit, Don't Come Home A-Drinkin', with Lovin' on Your Mind, and many of her early classics were surefire publications. Her story, in its early chapters, is inseparable from the story of the Wilburn brothers. It was, in many ways, the ultimate expression of their influence. They didn't just sing the hits, they created the stars who sang them. But in Nashville, as in any business built on dreams and money, relationships can be complicated. The very success that the Wilburns helped Loretta achieve eventually became a source of friction. As Loretta grew from a grateful newcomer into a confident, assertive superstar, she began to desire more creative and financial control over her own career. The lines between mentorship and management, friendship and business, began to blur into a tangled mess. This is the part of the story that often gets left out of the nostalgic histories, the controversy and the eventual painful split. In her autobiography, Coal Miner's Daughter, Loretta describes how she came to feel that the publishing and management contracts she had signed as a young, naive artist were no longer fair. She believed that the Wilburns, particularly the notoriously tough negotiator Doyle, were exercising too much control and taking too large a share of her hard-earned money. Doyle, from his perspective, likely felt that he had taken a huge risk on an unknown singer, invested his time and resources, and was entitled to the rewards of that investment. He had built the machine that made her a star, and he wasn't about to just hand over the keys. The disagreement escalated from tense business meetings to bitter, angry arguments. The warm, family-like atmosphere that had once defined their relationship turned cold and hostile. It all culminated in a series of lawsuits in the early 1970s. Loretta Lynn sued the Wilburn Brothers to be released from her contracts with Surefire Music and the Wilhelm Agency. The legal battle was protracted, expensive, and ugly, creating a deep and lasting rift that echoed all over Music Row. In the end, Loretta won her freedom, gaining control of her own publishing and career path, which allowed her to become the icon she is today. But the victory came at a tremendous personal cost. The beautiful friendship that had launched her career was shattered beyond repair. For years afterward, they were estranged, a painful silence existing between them. It was a sad and bitter end to one of country music's most successful partnerships, a cautionary tale about how easily business can poison art and friendship. As the 1970s wore on, the Wilburn brothers' own fortunes began to change. The polished, smooth Nashville sound, which they had perfected, was starting to fall out of favor. A new, grittier sound was emerging, the outlaw country movement, led by anti-establishment figures like Willie Nelson and Waylon Jennings. The musical landscape was shifting, and the Wilburns' brand of traditional, clean-cut country music was beginning to sound dated to a new generation of listeners. Their chart success dwindled, and their television show eventually went off the air. They continued to be beloved and respected members of the Grand Ole Opry and dedicated performers, but the height of their fame was behind them. Then, the unimaginable happened. The harmony was broken by a force far more final than any legal dispute or changing musical trend. In the late 1970s, Doyle was diagnosed with lung cancer. He fought the disease with the same tenacity he had applied to his business dealings, but it was a battle he could not win. For Teddy, watching his older brother, his lifelong partner, his other half, slowly succumb to the illness was an agony beyond words. Their lives had been so completely intertwined both personally and professionally that it was impossible to imagine one without the other. On October 16, 1982, Doyle Wilburn passed away. He was only 52 years old. The death of Doyle was, for all intents and purposes, the death of the Wilburn brothers. The perfect harmony was silenced forever. Teddy was utterly devastated, adrift in a world without the man who had been by his side since birth. He bravely tried to carry on with a solo career, and he remained a faithful performer at the Opry for 2 more decades. But it was never the same. The magic, the spark, that special sound they created together was gone. The crowds grew smaller, the applause a little less thunderous. Teddy Wilburn, once half of one of the most successful and powerful duos in country music, found himself living a quiet life, a living legend, largely overlooked by the modern country music machine. He watched as the industry he helped build moved on without him. He saw the artists he had nurtured become icons, while his own name faded from the public consciousness. In a particularly poignant and rarely mentioned story, it's said that in his final years, Teddy would sometimes visit the Country Music Hall of Fame and stand before the exhibits of his contemporaries, a bittersweet reminder of a time when he and his brother stood at the very pinnacle of their profession. There was a quiet, profound sadness to his later years, the sorrow of a man who had outlived not only his beloved brother, but, in a way, his own era. Teddy Wilburn passed away from a heart attack on November 24, 2003, finally reunited with the other half of his harmony. Beyond their own music, their influence as businessmen and television pioneers was immense. They understood the power of publishing and media in a way that few artists of their time did. The Wilburn Brothers show brought country music into millions of homes in living color, helping to popularize the genre and create a visual template for countless shows that followed, from Hee Haw to today's CMT. They were architects of the modern Nashville music industry, building an empire that controlled songwriting, booking, and television production.